Social hierarchies exist in every culture, and they often result in discrimination, social exclusion, and the continuation of a cycle of extreme poverty and human degradation. From the Dalits and the Burakumin in Asia to the Haratines in Mauritania and Sahel region, Somali Bantu in Somalia, Osu in Nigeria of Africa, to Roma Gypsies across Europe, and the DWD diaspora across Northern America.
Discrimination based on work and descent is a distinct socio-cultural phenomena. It specifically looks at prohibitions of certain fundamental human rights, and whenever they challenge these restrictions or prohibitions, there is an unleashing of violence that affects in gruesome murder, in displacement, in mass destruction.
Intersection between different kind of discrimination make pressure on the woman's situation, specifically in patriarchal system. I think it is why we need perhaps to look deeply on this issue.
Especially the marginalized group of Somali people. In one way they have a challenge from Al-Shabaab, the other way they have a challenge from the dominant clan. So they are very much suffering.
Only in Europe, it's 80% of the Roma population are actually facing the risk to fall in very deep poverty. Roma are being segregated in schools. They are receiving special education, which is much lower quality education, so they cannot enjoy the mainstream high quality education very often just because of the Romani origin. It's very hard to access jobs. There is a huge discrimination in employment.
If the Africa and Asia and Europe with the problem of anti-Gypsyism come together, I think the movement will be enough strong to get its ways to the UN platforms with the support of states of the world, states across the 5 continents to support it.
La démarche est à plusieurs niveaux. Les groupes concernés doivent être
The approach is on several levels. First of all, the concerned groups need to get sensitized so that they can get organized and free themselves so that they become the prime actors of this fight.
I believe that the future is forging our strength, making a stronger unity among ourselves, and building a critical mass.
So we're saying that these communities need to be identified and brought under a common law which prohibits anymore these fundamental human rights violations against them. It has to give equal access to justice. It has to give gender rights and a framework which protects the rights of the children and also specifically rights of people who are involved in conflict and disasters. And this is a whole network of human rights mechanisms needs to be taken up so that they will enjoy a common and equal life for all.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to this webinar today. I'm excited that we're having this, and allow me at this moment to introduce our moderator for today, Reverend Dr. Dinabandu Manchala, who will guide us through this session. And I will allow Dina to take over. Thank you so much.
Welcome to all of you. At the outset, on behalf of all of us, I would like to express our profound thanks and appreciation to the World Council of Churches, Dr. Kenneth Machata, Director of Public Witness and Diaconia, and Dr. Masiba Gunda, Program Executive, for hosting this very important event that calls for a discrimination-free world. At a personal level, I also deem it an honor and a privilege to have been asked to facilitate this conversation. you for inviting me back into the WCC space. It brings back many pleasant memories of my work in the WCC. Friends, we have gathered today to commit ourselves to end discrimination by focusing our thoughts and minds on the experiences of suffering and struggle of people discriminated on work and dissent. More than 260 million people go through such experiences worldwide. These are small, scattered, and isolated, with a plight and predicament rooted in cultures and traditions. There is a widely prevalent and morally irresponsible attitude to view their experience of injustice as normal or acceptable, and their aspiration as unworthy. But here we are with a determination to join our struggle. Before we do that, I want to mention three distinct features about this initiative and this space. One is that this event marks yet another milestone in WCC's legacy of engagement with efforts that affirm and promote human rights and human dignity, all the way from its inception in 1948. Its pivotal role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, its engagement to end apartheid in South Africa, and resist racism in many forms and places through the program to combat racism, its continued solidarity with the indigenous peoples and the Dalits, people with disabilities, and now with communities and people discriminated on account of work and dissent. In and through all this, WCC has been consistent in asserting that continued tolerance of and in adherence to cultures and practices of discrimination and exclusion are not the things that churches and Christians should be doing. Simultaneously, it has also asserted loud and clear that all human beings are equal and deserve to live with dignity and freedom. Two is that this also marks both a continuation of the legacy as well as the beginning of new partnerships with those who have been striving to fight for the dignity and rights of people made visible and treated as inferior. Communities and people discriminated on account of work and dissent. They make us aware of the edifices of injustice that are deeply embedded in many of our cherished cultures and religious traditions, with a view to see how civil society organizations and faith communities can work together to dismantle these unjust cultures and to restore dignity and rights of these most marginalized people. And three is that this is a space for moral discernment, not only for Christians and churches, but for all people of faith to reclaim and reassert our purpose as conscience keepers and also as nurturers of life, of goodwill and harmony than discord and division. I say this because certain religious resources have been and continue to be responsible for othering and excluding people. It is time that religious practice is redirected to restore the dignity and rights of the othered and the unjustly treated. Therefore, friends, I invite all of us into this space for such an exploration. Let us hope that we are able to discern some signposts at the end. With this introduction, let us get started with the first part of our presentation. But before I do that, let me invite Dr. Kenneth Mutata, Director of Public Witness and Diaconia, to offer his words of greetings as we get started on this. Okay, Dr. Kenneth.
Thank you, Brother Dinabantu. It's so good to see you again, together with other colleagues who have been in the trenches against all forms of marginalization and exclusion. Let me begin by welcoming you, particularly as the moderator of this conversation, and our colleagues, particularly Masiwa, who has been at the forefront of organizing the ecumenical engagement on all forms of discrimination and leading us to think about how the World Council of Churches can put this issue at the center of its work, particularly in the new strategic planning process we are all engaged in. Today's gathering is a small attempt to raise awareness of the reality and lived experiences of communities that are discriminated on the basis of the work they do and on the basis of their descent. And this is a phenomenon that is real, that is global, and that cuts across all the continents in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and many other parts of the world. What is important is that the WCC, collaborating today with the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Descent, we are entering a journey to conceptualize together, to set the agenda, to plan, and to start to work on a process of webinars that are going to raise awareness within the Christian communities, but also to see how we can broaden this to other broader faith communities so that this agenda is shared and that we can work towards committing to processes of transformation. It is important, therefore, as we enter this conversation, that the WCC and its member churches in all regions are taking up the responsibility to make sure that our commitment to fight discrimination on the basis of work and descent is something that remains a priority as we draw from the guidance from the General Assembly, the 11th General Assembly that has just passed. I want to welcome all of you to this conversation because in this conversation, you are going to inform how the WCC must carry out this work. We do not believe that we are in any position to inform how such difficult conversations must be carried out, but we believe that those who are already championing this agenda, people like you, can then inform how we upscale this work at global level and also bring back to the ground how these reflections are taking place in other parts of the world. Thank you very much, colleagues, for committing to this conversation, and we believe that it is going to enrich how we understand ourselves as the church together, but also how we become an inclusive and transforming church as we move forward together. I wish all of us a meaningful conversation. I will be in and out because we have two processes going on today. But for me, this is a priority conversation, and I look forward to be participating and learning from your input today. Thank you very much for having me in this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Kenneth Matata, for those kind words of welcome, encouragement, and also assurance of continued partnership of the World Council of Churches with what we are attempting to do. Friends, now let's get started with the first part of our webinar, which is called Opening Wounds, Listening to the Lived Experiences of Communities and People Discriminated on Work and Descent. As it's been said, there are many such communities around the world, but only 4 are represented here. Even as we get to hear the most common experiences, let us also be aware of the specific that many such communities go through. We have a panel of 5 eminent and deeply committed activists and change makers to help us to have some glimpses of the life worlds of these communities. Let me first introduce them before asking them to share their reflection. A lot can be said about each of our presenters, but I will be brief in order to give them more time to speak. You will find detailed information about them in the chat box. Please allow me to present them. To begin with, we have Mr. Paul Divakar Namala, convener of Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent. Paul is also the director and founder of the Inclusivity Project. Mr. Namala will give us an overview of the struggles of communities experiencing discrimination on basis of work and dissent. He will be followed by Dr. Simona Torochai, telling us about the issues and struggles of Roma people. Dr. Simona is an expert on Roma rights and leader of Ergo Network. Ms. Priyanka Sami will then expose us to the major aspects of the struggles of the Dalits against an age-old evil called the caste system. Ms. Sami is an anti-caste and intersectional feminist activist based in India and the youth convener of the National Federation of Dalit Women. Ms. Versilene Dias will follow to tell us about the Quilombola community in Brazil. Mr. Dias, a Kalunga Quilombola, is a lawyer and coordinator of the legal advisory services of the National Coordination of Articulation of Rural Black Quilombola Communities. And finally, and not the least, Dr. Brahim Ramdhane will tell us about the Haratian community in Mauritania. Dr. Ramdhane is the founder and director of Sahil Foundation. Sahil is an organization committed to fighting against slavery. Dr. Ramdhane has played a leading role in Mauritania's anti-slavery movement and even endured 19 months in prison as a result of his activism. Friends, with this introduction, let me invite our panelists. I want to tell our panelists that you each have 5 minutes. At the end of this presentation, we will have some time for question and answers, and I request the participants of this webinar to use the Q&A space to raise the questions. And I would ask, and after that, I would ask the panelists to respond to the question. To begin with, first, Mr. Paul Divakar. Please tell us about the urgency and necessity to respond to the issues and concerns of communities discriminated on work and dissent. Paul.
Thank you, Dinabandhu, and thanks to World Council of Churches and also the members of the Global Forum of Communities Discriminated on Work and Dissent who have organized and who have such a great panel. Let me dive directly into what is ahead. Communities discriminated on work and dissent face a very distinctive type of social structure distributed among multiple societies across the globe. Earlier, we used to think, Dalits are only in India, but then we see that it's across the world. They enact a particular set of human rights violations upon a particular set of people. This practice is quite unlike racism, indigeneity, and majoritarianism. This mode of oppression diminishes life chances of well over 260 million people. And if we count all of them and we put them in one place, we'll be the 5th largest country in the world. Their condition is yet to be fully recognized by the global community, including World Council of Churches, including United Nations and other institutions. So this is a very important session that we are having to see that how this hidden aspect and the phenomena has to be uncovered, visibilized, and addressed. We as communities do not share a common history or origin, just like indigenous and several other communities. But we have a common scarring by a social structure that ascribes us a permanent status of devalued personhood, and it forces us into stigmatized, exploitative forms of labor. This is different from other forms of discrimination. Many of them are colonial forms, which are still, but this is a kind of a pre-colonial form which exists in almost all these areas. The oppressor or the dominant group shares the same race, same ethnic background, same skin color, same language, same culture, and they predate, as I've said, colonial enslavement. The Dalit communities in Asia, in all the countries in Asia, Haratin, similarly in other communities in Africa, in several parts of Africa, and we have very prominent people from Mauritania, Dr. Brahim, who will share in that. The Romani or Roma people in Africa, in Europe, who range not just in Europe, there also is the diaspora in other parts of the world. The Burakumin in Japan and the Quilombola in Africa, in Brazil, are a small section of various groups who are experiencing this oppression through work, discrimination on work and descent. In many countries, it has not sufficiently been uncovered. And unfortunately, the leaders who have been taking this up have also not been sufficiently recognized. And we've not managed to link and interlink with them. But the experiences of communities discriminated on work and descent can be described in three major categories. For short of time, I will just do the top lines. One is the stigma of impurity, pollution, or uncleanness, and it is by birth, often reinforced by menial and manual professions. In most cases, discrimination based on work and descent stems from a cultural belief that labels victimized communities as unclean or polluted. And this pushes us into ancestral occupation. Whatever is the skills and academic qualifications we have, we find people who are still forced into just to keep them in their place. The second part is an endogamy, which is inability to relate intimately or to marry outside of one's so-called low caste status. Ensuring that each caste or social group is clearly delineated from other, that individuals stick to their own kind. This is one of the primary methods which the dominant social groups use, particularly one that since often no physical difference between the oppressor and oppressed class exists. You can't make out, but then because of the birth and then the prohibition of marrying. Many of you have heard honor killings, and this is not just in India. You've heard it you also have it in Somalia, and you have it in several other African countries, where just because they choose to marry within these communities, they are killed by their own and by the dominant groups. The third factor is segregation of public services and private spaces that mark CDWD as lesser human. Segregation is portrayed as a normal desired social order to maintain and ensure stability for all. So if you have segregation, and segregation, I think all of us know mostly as a race phenomena, but segregation is very much part of the communities discriminated on work and descent, whether it is Dalits in India or Asia, whether it is Ozu community in Nigeria, or several others in Mauritania, and I'm sure colleagues and leaders who are following me will share this in their presentations. So I'm honored to have these leaders and activists whom Dr. Bandhu has mentioned will be speaking their situation. So what do we want? We call for justice and protection of our rights to be free from discrimination, violence, and exclusion. Faith bodies like WCC, but also of other religions, especially Islam, Buddhism, and several other religions that we have, they have a very critical role to play in the membership, because they including Hinduism, reinforce these values and make sure that the separation and segregations and endogamy and the concepts of purity pollution exist. So undoing discrimination on work and descent, which is a social construct, needs to be emphasized by these faith bodies. And I call upon WCC and other faith bodies to make this into part of their theological training, part of their worship, part of their thing, that how do you make sure that you make zero discrimination in your own institutions, leave alone the societies. We also call for a UN declaration on the rights of the communities discriminated on work and descent to be adopted by all states, thereby enshrining the rights of CDWD and ensuring global protection and legitimacy for these communities across the globe. We ensure and we make sure and we demand recognition for these communities that are discriminated on work and descent, and these hierarchical systems of oppression to be completely eliminated in the wider society, whether it's in the schools, whether it's in occupational, whether it's in employment, whether it's in supply chains, whether it is in worship. I think this is one which really is very critical, because you may have a declaration, you may have a formal legislation, but until and unless the wider society and religion and cultural bodies make sure that this form is eliminated and condemned, we will not have a world which is free for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for that very pointed overview of the life world of communities discriminated on the basis of work and descent, and also for unveiling the most important and distinct features of their experience. I will now turn to Dr. Simona Torrechoy to tell us about the issues and struggles of Roma people, and also the challenges that she as an activist has been facing along the way. Dr. Simona.
Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for having me. My name is Simona Torrechoy. I'm from Romania, and I represent the Roma community. I'm here in my capacity as a Roma rights expert for the European Roma grassroots organizations. This is an umbrella NGO which aims to mobilize and connect organizations and individuals working together to combat anti-Gypsyism and Roma poverty, but also to strengthen the participation of Roma civil society in decision-making. As it was mentioned in the video, the Roma is one of the most disadvantaged groups in Europe. We originated from the Punjab region in northern India as a nomadic people, and we entered Europe in the 8th and 10th centuries. And once we reached Europe, the European population used to call us Atiganoi, which means that to refer to Roma as untouchables, somehow related to the Dalit community. We will also perceive as heretics, a community perceived to practice a different religion, mainly a non-Christian religion, and we were strongly associated with sorcerers, witchcraft, fortune-telling, and so on. Today, the Roma is the largest and the most vulnerable minority in Europe, currently making almost 18 million in Europe. Yet we are not all citizens of the countries we are living in. And this constantly puts obstacles in accessing our rights as residents or citizens of these countries. So unlike other minorities, we do not have a homeland or a country to identify with, and therefore we are vulnerable to discrimination, social exclusion, marginalization, and poor well-being. And we are also not a homogeneous group. The umbrella term Roma encompasses different groups, including Sinti, Calais, Ashkali, Egyptians, travelers, and many such. And in addition to these geographical groups that we have in Europe, there are also other intersecting identities, such as Roma women, youth, elderly, Roma migrants, which face multiple discrimination, and they have therefore different needs. For example, in 2017, in Montenegro, a Roma Muslim family was harassed by their Montenegrin neighbors, both for being Roma and for being Muslims. So we see how this is actually working in practice. But how discrimination based on work and descent is manifested when we speak about Roma. So recent data from the Fundamental Rights Agency shows that every fourth Roma feels discriminated against based on their background. So that's quite a substantial number, every fourth Roma. But also about 7 Roma experience at least one form of hate-motivated harassment in the course of a year. This specific form of structural discrimination targeting Roma, it's also known as anti-Gypsyism. Yeah, so this is a specific form of discrimination targeting Roma, mainly because our association and being considered as gypsies. So besides the everyday discrimination that occurs between individuals on an interpersonal level, the most prominent areas in which Roma are discriminated against takes place in education, employment, health, housing, but also in accessing the justice system. This puts important barriers in Roma being treated fairly. In education, as was mentioned in the video, most of the Roma children are placed in special schools, separated classes, just because the teachers or the school managers perceive them as mentally retarded or unclean. Even though in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights had specific decisions regarding school segregation. Similarly, in housing, almost half of the Roma, which were part of the Fundamental Rights Agency report, live in house deprivation, living in damp, dark dwellings, or housing without proper sanitation facilities. And every fourth Roma is still facing discrimination when looking for housing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there are many manifestations of this discrimination, but the point is that we are denied basic human rights, and we are victims of widespread discrimination, racist attacks, and hate speech. And this discrimination has severe implications both for the socioeconomic development, but also for the inclusion of Roma in the countries we are part of. Tackling structural discrimination and dispelling prejudice against Roma are essential to ensure that Roma can become equal citizens in European societies. Many thanks.
Thank you, Simona, for that description of the Roma reality. I know it is a lot that can be said, but given the limitation of time that we have, I think you've really sort of told us about the diverse reality and also the distinct features of Roma experience. Now, I would like to invite Priyanka Sami, Ms. Priyanka Sami, to tell us about the struggles of the Dalits against the age-old caste system and the distinct challenges that she and her colleagues in the movement face along the way. Priyanka, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank the World Council of Churches and the Global Forum for Communities Discriminated on Work and Descent for inviting me today. I'm absolutely honored to be here with all of you and have the opportunity to be part of this fantastic panel. Today, I'm going to talk about the caste system and throw light on caste-based discrimination and what it is to be a Dalit in South Asia. So if I were to explain what the caste system is in a nutshell, I would say that the caste system is the world's longest surviving social hierarchy. It is over 3,000 years old, 3,000 years. And the system is based on degrees of purity and impurity, with the Brahmins being the purest and right on the top, and the Dalits at the bottom of this social hierarchy being perceived as polluted and untouchable. So till date, the practice is widely pervasive not only in the Indian subcontinent, but across the globe through the South Asian diaspora. There are about 260 million Dalits worldwide, and over 200 million Dalits live in India alone, of which about 80 million are Dalit women and other marginalized gender. So despite 70 years of constitutional safeguards and equality before law in India, Dalits score the lowest on all development indicators. They still remain, in the bottom of the social hierarchy and face everyday discrimination. And this discrimination is systemic and historic and structural. To talk about caste, I think it is quite similar to race in the sense that oppression and discrimination in both cases are systemic in nature. Both these systems operate on the premise of exclusion. So the narrative of discrimination, hate, bigotry is only very familiar for us Dalits. But however, while race as a social construct may be understood as a way of classifying people in groups based on their physical traits, caste, on the other side, is a system of social stratification where groups are assigned a way of life defined primarily by occupation. So when you're born into a caste, you will die in that caste. So, caste is determined by birth and cannot be changed. So in the Indian subcontinent, the sort of continuance of casteist attitudes towards the Dalits has not drawn the same amount of global attention and solidarity as, for instance, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement. So in our case, the mere removal of formal discrimination has not automatically translated into the existence of an egalitarian society. And I think 70 years, in the case of India, 70 years post-independence and with all the constitutional guarantees, our lived realities haven't changed very much. So across the Indian subcontinent, if you see, these caste-induced power structures don't operate within social institutions alone, but they sort of influence all walks of life across the political economic spectrum. And therefore, the lived realities of this historically marginalized community is appalling. I have been asked to speak from the perspective of Dalit women and youth. So I would like to highlight that both Dalit women and youth, especially younger women and girls, are an extremely vulnerable constituency. I think Dalit women's social location of being at the lowest rung of the caste, class, and gender hierarchies result in us facing multiple forms of discrimination and targeted violence. Across South Asia, I think we have witnessed time and again how rape and other forms of sexual violence are used against Dalit women and young girls to sort of dehumanize the community and maintain caste-based hierarchies and power relations in the communities. As per the Government of India data, for instance, it says about 10 Dalit women are raped every day across the country. And this figure is a significant undercount, as most of these cases of sexual assaults don't even get reported because of the fear of a backlash from dominant caste communities. Therefore, there's a systematic sanction to violate Dalit women's dignity and rights. And the sort of social capital and network of impunity that people from dominant castes leverage is really, really appalling. And there's an increasing weaponization to our access to justice. And just to throw some light on Dalit youth, affirmative action in across South Asia for Dalit youth in education and in government employment has generated deep resentment among the dominant caste. For instance, caste-based discrimination, we see blatant casteism, physical exclusion, and indifference of the faculty towards the plight of marginalized students. And it's really pushing so many of our Dalit students to suicide. And despite measures being in place, administrations are doing very little to address the issue. There's a complete apathy from the state, complete apathy from administrations, and complete apathy from lecturers and professors and students alike. So the prevalence of caste-based discrimination in Indian universities has really been an open secret for decades now. You know, while some Dalit students' suicides have been widely reported in the recent past, you know, others have sort of just been hidden under the carpet. So, you know, we continue to face systemic barriers in our access to equitable education, in our access to equitable healthcare, water, sanitation, among other essential services, and of course, also equitable access to our civic, economic, political rights that have been sort of ensured in our constitution. Therefore, you know, policies that have a bearing on our lives are often made without considering our voice and largely blind to our concerns, sort of further widening the socioeconomic inequalities. I would like to conclude with a quote from Baba Sahib Ambedkar, a Dalit icon and the father of the Indian Constitution, where he very famously says, "Ours is a battle not for wealth, not for power. Ours is a battle for freedom, for reclamation of human personality." Thank you.
JP, thank you so much, Priyanka, for those very, very powerful words with which you ended. In fact, a lot can be said about the Dalits and particularly what Dalit women face in India, and also the challenges that are faced by the younger generation, especially students, in the discrimination they face in institutions of learning. We will probably have more time to learn about those things in the coming days. But I would like to invite Dr. Vassilini Diaz to tell us about the life world of the less known Quilombo communities in Brazil. Dr. Vassilini will speak to us in Portuguese.
Hello, good morning here in Brazil. Well, I would like to greet everybody here, colleagues, men, women that are part of this roundtable, of this panel, and I'd like to thank everybody for having me here. I'm Vassilini Diaz, I'm a Quilombolan. I live here in Brazil, and I coordinate the legal advising community for the Quilombolan community, which is a community of people of color. And this is to organize and to defend at the national level the rights of the Quilombolan community, the Quilombolan Black community. And Quilombolans are a group, it's an ethnic racial minority in Brazil that went through the colonial slavery process as the Brazilians had grew, and some organizations were birthed, and they differentiated whether it was given to religion or territories as well. And Quilombolan communities here in Brazil, they have their historical rights that were denied, but sometimes these rights, they should be guaranteed, but they're not really attributed. And at the national level and the regional level, there are some organizations that try to get them the rights they are due, but this is due to different factors, be it structural racism, discrimination, and these rights are denied. And this institutional racism is part of a historical framework that has placed Quilombolan communities in the outskirts of society, and has marginalized them and limited their access to just policies that would give them adequate quality of life in their territories and community. And today in Brazil, here CONAC estimates that we're talking about over 6,000 communities, and we have sort of a cloud of invisibility, or a cloak of invisibility placed over some of the communities, and over their rights as well. And only after 10 years of fighting for their rights have Quilombolan communities now achieved the ability to have to be present in the national census and to have their story told, who were the Quilombolans as well. And this is the first official data talking about this, and we're talking about this national census is to define, to map out where all the communities are present. But all these Quilombolan communities here in Brazil, their rights, their basic rights, the right to territory, which is one that is absolutely crucial for Quilombolan communities to survive, and which is granted by the Brazilian Constitution. And we know that at the global level, people discriminated based on work and descent, not only in Brazil, but Africa, Asia, Europe, or the rest of Latin America as well. We estimate that we're talking about over 260 million people at the global level were victims of discrimination. And some of the groups like Dalit group or Haratim as well, and the Bantu group from Sudan, the Roma people in Europe, and so forth. And here, the Quilombolan community, and also Palens in Latin America, these are all examples of communities who are discriminated based on work and descent. And some of these communities, they are groups that are excluded, marginalized, segregated, and that are placed in a vulnerable socioeconomic position. And in Brazil, discrimination against the Quilombolan community, for example, difficulty in access to education, or unable to access places of worship, or cultural development as well. And this comes to fruition through hateful speech as well as discrimination against the Quilombolan community, just because they have a different way of life, which is sort of different from the so-called traditional way of life here in Brazil. And the Quilombolan communities live through terror and feeling unsafe in their territories, even before this government took seat. So there was lots of discrimination against the Quilombolan communities. And one of the most known hateful speech made against the Quilombolan community that became famous was that we're humans, we're not animals, and some of these words made us feel unlike humans, and so some of our friends here as well in the indigenous community as well. And so during those 4 years with the Bolsonaro government, most of these Most of these, in this context of hate speech, this took place during 4 years of government, and so this started in 2018, of course, and all these discrimination, all these hateful movements, and then between 2019 and 2021, the work of CONAC, of the rural communities of the Quilombolan community, they surveyed, and that there were over 84 speeches, hateful speeches, were made by people in the public sphere, which, well, shouldn't be made, because these people in the public sphere, and they should fight for the rights of every single person, including discriminated ones. And all of these hateful speeches made by public authorities, only one of these speeches was punished by law. All of the other hateful speeches, one of them made by the former president of Brazil, this was taken up to the courts, but the courts decided that despite it being a discrimination-based speech, the words were not punishable by law, and most of these defenses that have to do with hateful speech in Brazil, they were looking at it from the same perspective. So to speak words was not punishable by law. That did not constitute a punishment by law, and so there was no justice for the communities that had their rights infringed upon by others. And and so knowing all of this, getting to understand all of these acts of discrimination and hateful speech, this type of discrimination and hateful speech, if it's not punishable by law, then it's made as if it were absolutely valid. And so the state and the national level should work to make sure that it's erased, that it's eliminated, this type of hateful speech and this type of practice. This could be considered as valid from society if it's not punishable by law. And so this makes it even worse when it comes to the sphere of discrimination, and makes living worse for people that just are merely struggling to lead their life normally here in the Quilombolan community, but not just the Quilombolan community as well. And
thank you, Ursulini. Thank you, Ursulini. We just have to stop because we are running out of time. Sorry about it. Yeah, I mean, thank you for your presentation, but I'm just conscious of the time that we may not have adequate time for the others. So please excuse me. And let me move over to the next speaker, Dr. Brahim Ramdani, to tell us about the Haratin in Mauritania. Dr. Ramdani.
It's a great pleasure for me to speak to you today, especially of this problem that is very important to me. Mine is Brahim Ramdam. I come from Mauritania. I belong to the Haratin community in Mauritania. Haratin, which means former slave of the Arabs of Mauritania. The Haratin community is originally made of black people from Western Africa, which were the victims of what we can call trans-Saharan slavery. We usually talk a lot about transatlantic slavery business, which brought Africans to the new continents. But there is a trans-Saharan slave trade route, which comes from the northern of Africa, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, and it is this trans-Saharan slavery which fixated slavery in Mauritania. Talking about slavery, I can say that I have a particularity is that I have lived slavery myself. For 20 years of my life, I was put as a slave. My mother, I saw her being a slave, working in families. My big sister, my big brother, and even my little brother. So I know the mentality, the spirit of the slaver, what he has in his mind. In the mind of the slaver, especially considering that we didn't give the opportunity for slaves to read and to write. They are all analphabets. They all don't know how to read and write. And so they believe, because they're ignorant, that God has made them slaves, and that to be good Muslims, they need to accept what God made them. And to be a good Muslim, they have to accept this status because God decided it for them. So we do not give the opportunity to slaves to learn to read, to write, and because of that, they believe this lie. They believe that God made them less than men. I spent 20 years of my life thinking deeply, believing deeply this. I thought that yes, this person, which is my master, my slaver, has the right to dispose of me as he wishes, because God gave him this right. By coincidence, worse coincidence, I was sent to school to complete a classroom that needed an extra person. And it was a chance and a coincidence. I am in school. I continue my study. I go to high school. And I start to understand that the situation of being a slave is not normal. That it is a false interpretation of Islam. That Islam is not in favor of slavery. In the contrary, that Islam tries to always try to free slaves. By reading the stories of the Prophet Muhammad and his friends, former slaves like Bilal, like Zayd, and others, there are people who flee slavery by going to Islam. And it is Islam that protected them, that liberated them, and it's Islam that imposed that men would be equal in front of God. So I want to say here that slavery in Mauritania left a community that is more than 50, that accounts for more than 50% of the population, which means 2 million of former slaves who are either slaves traditionally slaves, always considered as slaves, always used as slaves, and who themselves are aware that they are slaves and that they have to be slaves. But fortunately, most of them had an awakening through education, through work, and through organizations who fought against slavery in Mauritania. I am here. The movement Al-Hub, which means freedom, is the first movement who refused slavery in 1978. And I also want to quote SOS Slavery, who also since 1995 has denounced slavery. Also, IRA Mauritania, who worked on fighting slavery since 2010, and to which I belong, this organization, IRA, and we helped helping the cause. And today the Foundation Sahel, which I lead, fights against slavery, but not only slavery, but also the consequences, the sequels of slavery, which are ignorance, poverty. So the Foundation Sahel fights against slavery by education, because I believe that if I am against slavery today, it's because I went to school, and to help my peers to fight against slavery, to refuse slavery, we need to help them go to school. That's what our former masters didn't allow us to do. It's what our slave forbidden us to do. And so let's go to school and we will understand that slavery is not a part of religion. It's a false interpretation of religion. I want to say that the state of Mauritania, in agreement with the religious forces that control justice in Mauritania is controlled by religious forces, archaic forces, who are slaves themselves, and who monopolize justice in Mauritania. And for this, the problem isn't moving on the level of justice. On the level of the law, Mauritania has incriminated slavery officially. There are institutions that fight against slavery, but in the practice, we are not moving at all, because there is no application of laws, there is no follow-up, because our leaders, by installing these laws, they didn't plan to apply them, but on the contrary, they just did it to show to the Western countries that they had put up measures. But it's in reality nothing is being enacted. So it's a false interpretation of Islam. I repeat it. Islam was used. Religion was instrumentalized to justify slavery, and at the same time, by making slave ignorant and unable to read, is keeping them in this lie. Islam is not in favor of slavery, but only Islam of Mauritania, only interpretation of Mauritania. And it is this interpretation in the books that are taught in monastery that install slavery, which is why when I was in Iraq in 2012, we had burnt these books to put forward that they are not Islam, that they are false interpretation of Islam, and we keep with the same strategy to fight against slavery through education. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ramdane, for that very powerful personal account of the experience of slavery in your own situation. And one thing that I really liked what you said is that slavery is against God and we must stop using God to justify slavery. And I would even extend it by saying that even discrimination is not according to God. Even God also doesn't like discrimination. So we must stop using the name of God. So friends, I would like to thank each one of the panelists for those very focused details about the respective communities that they come from. And friends, we are running out of time. We have just about 10 minutes to seek clarifications for the questions that have already been posted in the chat box. I'm going to ask Dr. Masiva to read out those questions, and then after he reads out the questions, I would request the presenters to respond to those specific ones. And I hope we will certainly have time to get into the next one. I want us to finish this part of it in another 5 to 6 minutes so that we have time for the next second part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my brother. I'll just read all the 4 questions, and then I think the panelists can choose which one they want to answer. So the first one has already been partly answered in the chat. How does DWD or discrimination on work and descent impact the lives of children in these communities and their access or entitlement to children's rights? Second, how is it possible that the Roma community members are denied of their right to citizenship in the countries they dwell, despite their life in these countries for centuries? Why has the UN and the respective countries not woken up to this despicable situation, despite the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Question 3. What can be done towards getting accurate census of communities discriminated on work and descent across the world? As from India experience, there is no caste-based census to actually get the benefits of affirmative action. And also the present census is of 2011. Can a commission be thought of? We are in the 21st century. The last question, looking towards the future, how about the WCC organizing a world conference in New York on eliminating inequality and injustice against DWD communities in order to uphold the rights of the DWD communities and to apply pressure on the UN Assembly to bring out a UN declaration recognizing their rights and entitlements?
Thank you, Dr. Gunda, for that. And I would like to invite the speakers to quickly respond. I mean, like not all of you need to respond, but if you think that there is something that you should and you have something to offer, please do that. Who is going to go first? Maybe Simona, there is a direct question to you, so maybe you can go first. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, it's a very relevant one. The issue is complex depending on the country we are speaking about. In some countries, you have to prove your residence. And as I said, most of the Roma do not have a house. They don't have documents for that house. In some countries, you have to prove that, I know if you are a child who doesn't have documents, you have to prove that this person is your mother or your father. But the problem is that it's a generational issue. Parents don't have documents, so therefore their children most likely don't have documents. And this affects also very much the rights of the children, which was also one of the questions here. First, these people don't access their social benefits or all sorts of indemnizations for children. They cannot access or enroll schools because of the lack of documents. So it's a problem. Authorities are trying to hide this. Last year, for example, in Romania, I asked the national authority to provide me with information about the number of people who don't have an ID. So we're speaking about IDs, not necessarily about citizenship. That's another level. And they were not able to provide me with a number. So it's an issue that's not really visible in front of the authorities. A lot of civil society organizations are still advocating for facilitating or promoting legislation that facilitates access to IDs, and then other sorts of rights.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else who would like to respond? Any of the speakers? Oh, well, I see Mr. Hamadi's hand up. Would you like to ask a question? Mr. Hamadi, would you like to ask you? I see your hand up. Briefly, because we are actually,
bonjour.
Hi.
Bonjour.
Hi everyone.
Bonjour les
Hi experts.
Je voudrais, avant de
I'd
poser la
like to
question,
ask a
apporter une
question
petite
to
contribution
give some
complémentaire
information
à ce qu'a dit le grand frère Brahim
to what Brian Bilal said.
que je salue. Sur la question
This
des
is a
haratis.
question of halatin.
La question des haratis est
This
très
is a very
complexe. Ensuite, il
complicated
y a un
question.
fait qu'il faudra
We
mentionner
have
et
to
que
mention that slavery,
dans la
in the
compréhension de
comprehension of
l'esclave
slavery
en
in
Mauritanie,
Mauritania,
l'esclave n'a pas
the
droit
slave
à
does not
l'héritage.
have no right of
Ce phénomène,
inheritance.
il existe et cela. Et il y a des
And
pratiques qui ont
that's
été
practice that
lieu
happened
à l'époque et ça
at the
continue
time
aussi
and
dans
still
certaines
going
zones
on now
que
in some
l'esclave,
areas.
quand
When
il
the
meurt,
slave
tous ses
died,
biens
all
appartiennent
its
au maître.
belongings
Ça,
do
selon
not belong to
la compréhension
him or
de
his family.
l'esclavagiste. Ensuite, il y a
And then
aussi le problème
there's
du
a
droit au
problem
mariage.
of the
La
right
fille
to
esclave
marry.
n'a pas
The
droit à
woman
être
slave
mariée sans
cannot
le
marry
consentement de son maître.
if her masters do not agree.
Ça aussi, il faut que ça soit
So to precise
précisé
that.
dans ce sens-là.
Then
Ensuite, autre élément
another
important
important
et d'ailleurs
element
qui bloque l'avancée de la cause des haratines, c'est la
is the
non-reconnaissance des haratines en tant qu'entité
recognition of Haramati
dans la
in the
constitution
constitution
mauritanienne.
of Mauritania.
Les haratines sont considérés comme les Arabes, ils
They're
sont
not considered,
comptabilisés dans la communauté arabe.
they're considered
Alors
as
qu'ils constituent,
Arabics,
comme a dit M.
and they're
Brahim,
counted as
ils
that,
sont 50% minimum de la
but they're
population,
still
mais ils ne
they're
sont
at
pas
least
reconnus en
50%
tant que
of the
communauté
population, but are not
distincte
recognized as
dans
a
la constitution.
distinct
Ça bloque
population,
tout. Quelqu'un qui n'est pas
which
reconnu
blocks
dans une
everything, because
constitution
if you're
d'un
not
pays,
recognized
il
in
n'est
the
pas considéré comme
constitution,
un
you're
être
not
humain.
really
Ça,
recognized as
c'est
a
extrêmement
human being.
important et il faut vraiment
So we need to fight a lot
et beaucoup
for
d'engagement
that,
pour que ça puisse
so it could happen.
arriver un jour.
So my question
Maintenant,
please
c'est à
question.
propos
Please question.
de la communauté
is
Dalit.
about the community Dalit.
La communauté Dalit, d'après ce que j'ai
From what I
compris,
understood,
c'est une communauté assez forte, mais très, très, très
it's a
marginalisée et
very
discriminée.
marginalized community and discriminated.
Quelles sont
So
les
what
avancées
are the
qu'ils ont eu
progresses
à
that they had to
réaliser
realize
depuis qu'ils ont
since they
commencé
started
le
their
combat?
fight? Thank you
Merci
very
beaucoup, je
much.
vous remercie.
Thank you. I think, just as much as we would like to continue this conversation, but I think given the fact that we are really running short of time, I would like to sort of move to the next part of this webinar, which is expert perspectives. Actually, we have invited two experts to help us through this particular piece of the particular section of the seminar, webinar, but we have with us, we are fortunate that we have Dr. Rita Itzak with us, but Dr. Azza Karam, Secretary General, Religions for Peace, unfortunately not able to be with us because of an urgent UN-related task. So we shall listen to Dr. Itzak and then sometime in conversation on discerning the way ahead. Dr. Rita Itzak is a senior advisor on anti-racism, UNDP, United Nations Development Program, and former special rapporteur on minority rights and a former member of the Convention of Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Dr. Itzak, please help us to find ways through which we can be involved in the struggles of the communities discriminated on work and dissent for justice and rights. And after your presentations, we do hope to have some time for conversation with you, but let's see how we go with that. Thank you. I invite Dr. Itzak.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending where you are. And thank you for the invitation to this webinar. And I really want to thank the speakers before me who so candidly shared their own experiences. And I'd like to thank the organizers for bringing us together again. I have a few points to say in definitions, concepts, rights and violations, but I would really like to say at the beginning that it's so important to recognize the power in uniting on these issues. Because as we heard from the presentations before, the communities that were represented today and who we have been talking about are often regarded as inferior in their own societies, and they carry a stigma. And so it can be very difficult for the communities themselves to bring this up and challenge the status quo. But when we come together and we unite our forces and we try to speak with one voice, we are much more powerful. So I really see the opportunities that we have when we come together and we don't try to just advocate, as single community representatives. It can be really difficult and very discouraging. And as we heard, it can go on for centuries or even thousands of years. The social arrangements that keep us as certain groups in an inferior position to the others. So it is really a great opportunity to come together like this and to plan together. So what we do collectively for each other and with each other in the future. And so I was listening to you and I was thinking of all these challenges and violations that we have and how we can overcome it and what are the entry points. And because I used to be a UN official while I'm still working for the UN, I would like to maybe share with you just a few recommendations in this regard. First of all, I think it's very important that we keep this issue on the agenda of the different monitoring bodies. But I used to sit at the Committee on Racism, as it was said in my introduction, it's the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We always welcomed civil society reports and also, of course, community representatives at our meetings who came and testified, because this is the way that we can also ask the right questions from the governments. So I really like to encourage you to follow what these different bodies do, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, also on the Protection of the Rights of the Child, or the Committee on Racial Discrimination, because this is a very important platform and opportunity for you to raise these issues through the voice of the experts who can question the governments. And the governments will be forced or asked, not forced, we can't force them, but of course asked to respond to the questions, and then we can include it into our final observations. Similarly, as you know, there are special rapporteurs, independent experts, and working groups who take up these issues to travel to countries. It's really important to track where they are going, to keep in touch with them. And if they come to your country or if they cover a topic, because there are also thematic reports, so if they cover a topic that is relevant to communities who are discriminated based on their work and descent, that you provide information so they can also cover this. And then there is the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council, which is a peer review process. It is important because governments are reviewing governments, or states are reviewing states. So it is always taken very seriously what they say to each other. So really, this is just a call for you to use your voice, to come to the different UN fora. These are all open, and of course there are many others, but I don't want to bore you with the details. If I may recommend the report that I presented to the Human Rights Council in 2016, it's about caste and analogous forms of discrimination. And in this report, I was trying to put together the different rights violations and recommendations in this regard. And I was talking about, as also many of you already mentioned, for example, the use of violence against individuals and communities, then torture, ill treatment, including sexual violence, and talked about entrenched discrimination within criminal justice systems and the multiple obstacles that victims face. I also talked about political marginalization, how lower caste groups are often excluded from voting opportunities, or they have just lesser opportunities to run for and to be elected to public positions. I talk about forced and bonded labor, segregated arrangements, lack of access to drinking water and sanitation, also disasters and hazards, let them be natural or human-made, and also about emergencies, because we had reports of and evidences that these communities are less likely to receive humanitarian aid and rehabilitation after these catastrophes. I also talk about healthcare systems, education, and then access to religious sites. And I have a full chapter dedicated to women from disadvantaged class groups, early and forced marriages, bonded labor, harmful cultural practices. And I also said and emphasized in this report that atrocities against women from marginalized castes are often committed when they try to assert their rights and challenge caste and gender norms. And violence and the threat of violence against women and girls frequently go unreported, allowing a culture of invisibility, silence, and impunity. So now the question is, what do we do? And what do we do together? So there are a few things to do. First of all, if I know many of you are following the Sustainable Development Goals, because there are so many that are important for us and governments are committing themselves to achieve these goals. First of all, we need to recognize that unfortunately we don't have enough disaggregated data. So we heard about the quilombola, that now the first time that in Brazil they get recognized. We know that scheduled castes and tribes and other backward tribes, I think as it is called, is also in a practice in some South Asian countries, especially in India. But for example, when it comes to Roma, we don't really know what's going on. It's usually survey results that we have at disposal. But let me remind you that the 2022 Sustainable Development Goals report emphasized that timely, high quality, and disaggregated data can help trigger more targeted responses and design the urgently needed actions. However, this report found serious data gaps and said that it makes it difficult to fully comprehend the pace and the progress towards the realization of the 2030 agenda, different across regions, and also to know who is left behind. So first of all, we need to be better in advocating for disaggregated data so that we can show all these disparities that you already described in your statements. Then we also have to make sure that discrimination is codified. And if you need an inspiration for this, then you can go to the UN principles and guidelines for the effective elimination of discrimination based on work and descent, which gives a long definition. I'm not going to quote all, but just to give you a bit of a taste. So it says that any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on inherited status such as caste, including present or ancestral occupation, family, community or social origin, name, birthplace, place of residence, dialect, and accent. And I read this whole list because it tells you that this is where we can also bring in all the communities that are discriminated based on work and descent. And we have to make sure that this is codified in the national legislative system so that we have a basis, of course, to advocate for actions. I also called, of course, for, and I think this is very important to remember that we need community-based approaches, because when it comes to these groups and the stigma and the inferiority that is attached to these groups, we know that it's not enough to have legal and political responses, but we need much more than that. We need dialogues in the society. We need open-mindedness. We need to come together and challenge all these notions and beliefs. And maybe because my time is up, we are talking about faith leaders and faith groups today. So I wanted to bring you some good examples and reference points to this. So one that I'd like to recommend is on the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it's called Faith for Rights. It's a toolkit. It's for religious leaders. And it's a whole program to facilitate discussions for different faith groups around rights and human rights. And what I liked is that there are 5 principles that that is expected to be, like the leaders are expected to commit to when they do this exercise. And the first is that there is a need for concrete action. Dialogue is important, but it's not an end in itself. Good intentions are of limited value without corresponding action. Change on the ground is the goal, and concerted action is its logical means. So this is how it all starts. Then it also obliges the faith leaders to avoid theological and doctrinal divides in order to act on areas of shared interfaith and intrafaith vision. It asks them to balance united voice of solidarity, reason, compassion, moderation, enlightenment, and corresponding collective action at the grassroots level. It also asks for introspectiveness, which means that faith communities must speak up and act first and foremost at their own weaknesses and challenges within their own respective communities. It also requires faith leaders to speak with one voice, especially against violence and discrimination. It says that they have a duty to redress hate speech by remedial compassion and solidarity that heals hearts and societies alike. The words of redress should transcend religious or belief boundaries. Such boundaries should thus no longer remain a free land for manipulators, xenophobes, populists, and violent extremists. And it also asks for an independent manner of conducting all this and being abide by conscience by seeking partnerships with all those who also relate to the same. So I just quoted it because faith communities can do a lot about getting rid of or challenging the different beliefs and the negative beliefs about the communities that we came together to protect today and to talk about today. And then a second good example, and I will finish here, I received this when I was in Doha, Qatar. This is by the National Human Rights Committee. I'm blurred, so I don't think you can see much, but it's actually a compilation of different United Nations treaties and documents with the rights, and it finds the corresponding provisions in the Quran according to Islam. So it's just a really good example that I found how religion can come together with human rights. So you can see these cards, they are very beautiful, but again, it's very hard to show you because of my background. And I will show you maybe two. So in the background, you have the corresponding articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, and then you also have the Quran on the top on what it says. So for example, about Article 2 of the UDHR, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language. So this is the non-discriminatory provision. It quotes the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who said, "People are equal like the tooth of the comb," right? It looks like this. And then I show you just another one, which is about the article first, that human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Again, it refers to the Prophet's words and says, "An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white except by piety. All mankind is from Adam, and Adam is created from clay." So these are just positive examples of how faith leaders can really take up action and not just talk, because as we said, dialogue is the starting point, but not the end of it. And so I hope that by today, and with the help of the World Council of Churches, we can actually also include them more and more into the protection of communities who are discriminated based on work and descent. And the last message, that we should also think about a possible declaration, and I have been recommending it, and I know Paul is also a big advocate for this, because if we actually design a declaration, which could be tabled at the Human Rights Council, then we could codify all these rights. So these rights could, for example, be about right to self-identification, of denying the identity forced upon these communities, the right to marry outside of the groups, right to freely choose profession and work, and freedom to renounce inherited occupations or degrading or hazardous work, right to challenge untouchability practices, right to move freely, having referral mechanisms in place for cases of exploitation, trafficking, contemporary forms of slavery, protection from violence, including sexual violence, the right to participate in decision-making processing, and etc. So if we could actually have a declaration that brings all of us together and then codifies our rights, I think we would be better positioned to advocate for their implementation as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Itzhak, for that very powerful presentation. You really gave us a vivid description of the range of experiences that these communities go through. And at the same time, you have also sort of opened the possibilities, opened our eyes to the possibilities that are with the United Nations mechanisms to sort of seek solidarity and support from various actors. And at the same time, you emphasize the need for us to work together and to move together. Thank you very much for that. And at the same time, you have also filled in the space that we were actually missing by talking about, how faith communities and faith resources can accompany us in this search for liberation from oppression, stigma, and poverty, and a whole lot of other experiences. Thank you very much for that. I would like to invite if there is any questions that we have for Dr. Rita Itzhak. Dr. Masiba, do you see any questions?
Actually, there was a question that Rita has just responded to, I think, effectively, which was, what do the panelists think about engaging with the global interfaith groups internationally, UN, etc., on the issue of CDWD? I think that has been answered quite well.
In that case, would you please allow me to sort of move into the third part, which is the most important part of our webinar, which is how can faith communities, such as the World Council of Churches and its member churches and all others, accompany the communities and people discriminated on the basis of work and descent. As I have said in my introduction, much of these discrimination and injustices are rooted in culture, religion, and traditions. And I think the churches and faith communities have a very important role in sort of dismantling some of these unholy and anti-life traits. So therefore, I would like to sort of invite our panelists, if you can just take 1 or 2 minutes to share your own insights on how can faith communities be in solidarity or work with you, the civil society organizations, as you work to dismantle these structures and systems and cultures of discrimination and exploitation. So would you please, who would like to go first? I mean, Paul, would you do that to start with? And then we can follow the same order, one after the other. Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Bandhu. I would really like to appreciate and thank Rita for bringing in very clear, specific suggestions and also good practices. Maybe we shouldn't digress too much away from that. So one, I would say, is it possible, not is it possible, an appeal to World Council of Churches to bring together other major religions, especially Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and I mean, there are several others. I don't think we can only, there are several others. Is it possible to have a dialogue specifically focusing on these systems which have deep-rooted cultural and religious beliefs, which force the communities and which force even so-called right-thinking people in the dominant group among their own membership to somehow acquiesce into these forms? They are not able to stand up. They are not able to have a legitimacy because they say, I believe it, but my husband, my wife, my mother, my children, my grandmother, this kind of things are specifically being enforced by systems like, cultural beliefs, which are reinforced by religion. So internally, can WCC, like at some point, I think has done on caste, it has done, but now it is much beyond caste. Can it have a dialogue internally and bring out a statement? Number two, externally, engage with the other religions to form a dialogue on, especially on something as what Rita suggested, with those principles, enter into a collective process to dismantle this externally. And third, I think, is support us in bringing the global declaration on the rights of the communities discriminated on work and descent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for that. And maybe, Simona, would you have anything to say on this?
Yes, and it's maybe a bit too personal, but it has to do with the religiosity among Roma. So we don't have a religion of our own, but we try to kind of follow the dominant religion in the countries we stay. But more recently, we have seen that there is some sort of conversion among Roma to the new religious denominations all across Europe. And this has seemed to have a strong potential to bring about social change and also to mobilize Roma communities to advance their rights. So that's kind of we see that there's a positive trend there. And the more personal thing, it has to deal with one of the members of the World Council of Churches, the Romanian Orthodox Church. And Roma in Romania have been slaves for 500 years. And most of the Roma slaves were owned by the monasteries of the time. So we are speaking about the year 1850, when the Roma slaves were freed. And even nowadays, the Romanian church is not acknowledging its role in maintaining this system of slavery. And I think it's time that they acknowledge this role, but also that they take some sort of responsibility, not necessarily reparations, but at least an apology, or more importantly, making accessible all sorts of historical documents and records of the Roma slaves. So in order to know what really happened and what was the situation of the time. So I think for me personally, that would be an important step. Every year on the 20th of February, we are commemorating the abolition of slavery in Romania. And I think that would be an important step for fighting this view of Roma and anti-Gypsyism as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Priyanka?
Yes, thank you. I think within our churches moving forward, we should really shift our strategies from a single access understanding of oppression and adopt intersectional approaches and sort of take cognizance of CDWD communities, both as historical victims and agents of change within our churches and society at large. And I think it's high time that we pay the path for people from CDWD communities and give them a seat at all decision-making tables within our churches. And I'm talking about substantive representation, not just tokenistic representation. I think it's really imperative for CDWD perspectives and priorities to be maintained, to be mainstreamed in the policies we design within our churches. And lastly, I think in order to achieve equity, we need to push our churches to adopt policies that target improvements for marginalized communities, not just from the service provision point of view, but to sort of really focus on challenging the status quo, which is hegemonic colonial norms and discourses, really through bringing about transformational policies within our churches. I think we need to sort of really widen the concept of social justice within our churches, especially from the lens of intersectionality. Only that can sort of pave the way to redistributive justice. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Priyanka. Verselini, would you have anything to offer, please?
So, to sum it all up, with all this context of discrimination, I believe that, well, most of the speakers before me have also mentioned this. We need to we need to enact guidelines, whether they be political, educational, legislative as well, to avoid violence and discrimination and segregation in the communities. But we also need to create mechanisms and structure to survey, to monitor the efficiency of these policies, legislative as well. And we need instruments to do that and make sure that the instruments that are already in place, that they're applied and that they're completely efficient as well. And this, besides, if these are not punished by law, the transgressions, this validates all the transgressions that could come afterwards, and this invalidates the dialogue as well. And so the fight against discrimination is extremely important to make sure that all these instruments that are set in place, they reach their full efficiency, and all the new mechanisms as well, they're able to protect people from all the rights that are trying to be taken away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ramdhane. Yes, Dr. Ramdhane, yes.
Hi.
Yes, you're right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just a minute, please. I did a comment about 2 points. I want to say that slavery, all discriminations were imposed by religion. To get rid of it, we need to use religion, because it is by this that we change our mind and slavery. So by religion, we can take this off. So take off this fake interpretation of text and says that it's not religion. Then this is not the only religion. This is also ignorance, because what slaves and slaverists are generally analphabet. I mean, for us, for Mauritania, for Mali, when slavery still exists, this is by religion, in religious areas. So all religions needs to be together in this fight. And so all religions have those examples. So I want to thank my friend as well for what they said, which is very important. So slave is discriminated twice. And the woman slave is 3 times discriminated, because they're slave and they're illiterate and undervalued. And the woman, because she's a woman, because she's a slave, and because she's illiterate. So she's used, she's raped in the families when she's a slave. No, by religion, origin, we can make work together to take to have a declaration with all religions to say that slavery is not in the religion. On the contrary, and religious people need to speak, because this is the same people that practice slavery that was imposed by religion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I would like to thank all our panelists for sharing their reflections on a very important topic, although in a very short time, but I think they have really sort of touched upon very important issues. You know, I think it certainly points to the need for us to work more in this area of working with faith communities and civil society organizations, working together to address this particular challenge that is before us. And, I just want to sort of list out some of the things that have been said, that it's a call to the WCC to bring together the faith communities to address this particular challenge in the world today, and to work towards a statement or on this particular experience, a kind of a declaration. And we also talked about the need to initiate processes of healing and reconciliation, especially with those who have been subjected to centuries of slavery and mistreatment. And we also talked about the need for ensuring spaces for participation and for self-expression of these communities, especially in all places wherever religious communities have their influence and power. And at the same time, Priyanka also pointed out, I wanted to say that the churches certainly have a moral responsibility to show the way. And we have also been told that it is not just one approach, that there are many approaches that we need to adopt: education, advocacy, working with religious communities, building solidarity with other civil society organizations. All that needs to go into what we would like to do as part of the work ahead. And at the same time, finally, we also talked about, we must sort of condemn and expose all attempts to misuse and abuse religions to legitimize oppression, discrimination, and exploitation of the vulnerable people. And, because this is very important, because, it is morally imperative for faith communities to uphold the sanctity and integrity of life, particularly amidst the threats posed by the contemporary world, which is marked by one, growing intolerance for diversity and difference, and increasing tolerance for and legitimization of injustice. And religious resources and institutions are being misused and abused to divide and destroy life than to affirm and protect life. So with this particular challenge, I would like to once again want to thank all our presenters for their excellent presentations, walking us through the life worlds of the people discriminated, and at the same time offering us hope that in various ways by sharing with us wonderful possibilities, and also sort of sharing their reflections on what can be done for us to work together. So with those few words, I would like now to thank once again and invite our host, Dr. Masiva Gunda, to close this conversation with his words. But once again, I want to thank him for that, and thank the World Council of Churches for offering this space and extending this hand of partnership with us. Thank you very much. Dr. Masiva Gunda.
Thank you so much, my brother, Dinabandu. I don't know how to close a conversation like this, because this has been a powerful conversation that has helped us realize the breadth and depth of discriminations that are going on in this world. And not only happening in the areas where we normally associate with discrimination. We are finding these discriminations even in the so-called citadels of freedom, of democracy, of all the kinds of things that should be putting us as people that are way developed, but we're continuing to see these discriminations. So giving closing remarks after so powerful speakers is not an easy task. But allow me to first of all say the World Council of Churches is aware and is committed. And that is why in this program, it has been deliberately named the program to overcome racism, xenophobia, and related discriminations, because there was an appreciation that racism and xenophobia is not doing enough or is not exhaustive of the kinds of discriminations that a lot of communities are experiencing. And as we could not give these other discriminations one clear name, we said these discriminations, in a way, when we look at them, are related to racism, but they are also related to xenophobia. But they are not really racism, they are not really xenophobia, but they are related in a way, because they are based on a system that creates a degree of permanence in terms of what distinguishes, what differentiates us. So with racism, there was the idea of color. But with caste, there's the idea that if your great-great-great-grandfather did this kind of work, this is your station in life. So it creates a situation of permanence that cannot be changed. And so we see some relatedness. And that is why I am excited that over the almost 2 years that I've been with the World Council of Churches, I'm sure Paul's email box and Priya's mailbox is full of my emails. And we have been in contact because this is a situation that we are particularly passionate about, because 260 million people is not nothing. Because remember, one life is one too many already if it is exposed to unfair and unjust discrimination and deprivation. And we also are shocked by the situation that is being faced by Roma communities, where statelessness becomes a reality for people that know not too many other countries that they have lived in, and yet they cannot access citizenship. And we are therefore, particularly as World Council of Churches, committed to inclusive citizenship across the globe. People have to belong. The exportation of discrimination based on work and descent is a development that is worrying. Because for some people, we think that Roma people are only discriminated when they are in Europe, or the Dalits are discriminated when they are in South Asia, or the Quilombola when they are in Brazil. But we are beginning to also observe that because of the high levels of migration, when Dalits migrate to the USA, to Europe, they meet other Indians and are still exposed to the exact same treatment that they have faced all their lives. And this is something that we take cognizance of. But what is more worrying and disturbing, but also I am happy that it came out from your presentations, is that religions have been complicit and sometimes continue to be complicit in these discriminations. We do not take pride in religion becoming an instrument of deprivation, an instrument that inhibits the enjoyment of life by all people of God. But we acknowledge that religion has not been clean. And therefore, this is something that the World Council of Churches takes seriously, and we try, from the perspective of the World Council of Churches, to encourage our churches to self-introspect. How have we contributed to what has happened? And how do we begin to contribute to dismantle that which we helped to put in place? And I appreciate the acknowledgement that education is critical in dismantling these structures. Because, friends, most of these structures are socially constructed systems. And socially constructed systems that have over the years been entrenched and sustained by faith and law. Which means if we are to unlearn, to dismantle these or to deconstruct them, we need to find a way of keeping this duality. We need to have this two-pronged approach to fighting for justice. We have to bring on board faith, but we also have to bring on board law. So the UN mechanisms and the world faith communities coming together to dismantle what they helped put in place is critical. And therefore, we need to appreciate the contributions and the presentations from Dr. Rita and how we can make use of the UN mechanisms. These mechanisms are not perfect, but at least there is something that we can begin to work with while we continue to lobby and advocate for better mechanisms. Let us not wait to use the mechanisms until there is something perfect, because it might not come in the near future. So let us try and use what is there. And coming together, I am particularly, and I said this to Paul when we met late last year, the idea of coming together to create the global forum of communities discriminated on work and descent is an inspired move. If we come together, we strengthen our voice, we strengthen our hand. And I am particularly appreciative that you still, without being Christians, because it's not that the World Council of Churches only works with Christians. We work with communities that need accompaniment, irrespective of their faith. And we are grateful that GFOD is open to working with the World Council of Churches. And the idea of a global conference is an interesting idea that I am going to try and present within the WCC and see how this could shape up. And I will certainly keep you in the loop in terms of what is happening here. But this is an idea that I'm particularly excited about. And the Romanian Orthodox Church situation is a very specific one that I am going to present to the leaders within the WCC, as specific as it is. I cannot promise anything, but what I can assure you is the leaders will know of this situation, and I'm sure the leaders will find a way of engaging with the Romanian Orthodox Church in terms of how this situation can be handled. So we're grateful, we're not proud about it, but it is important that we acknowledge what has happened so that it will not happen again. And so I am very grateful. What is only left for me is to thank you all for honoring the call, all the participants. I see we have been in our high 40s throughout, which is particularly pleasing that we have so many people coming in from so many communities from all over the world. I know for some of you, it's already ungodly hours. And for some of you, it's still too early in the day, but we all made time to be here today. We feel proud that we were able to make this happen. And we don't want this to be just that meeting. We want this to be a platform that launches for continuous conversations until justice is achieved, because that is how it should be. So we, as the World Council of Churches, will always be there to accompany you, and will always be there to listen, to create platforms, and we will certainly be looking at an interreligious platform to address this challenge. So we are open to suggestions and contributions that will come from all of you. we are a Christian organization, but we work with all people of God because we believe as Christians, everyone, not only Christians, everyone, every human being is created in the image of God. And therefore, if there's an injustice, the World Council of Churches is committed to working with you, to listen to you, and to be there for you whenever we are needed. I thank you for this opportunity. And I want to thank you, my brother Dina Bandu, for championing and directing all of us today. I want to thank Marcelo and Sandy, two colleagues from the World Council of Churches that have been giving us technical assistance today. I know it's not very easy because I cannot do what they are doing. So I appreciate very much what you have done for us today, colleagues. I have nothing else but just to thank you for all the words, the learnings that we have had today. We've learned a lot. Thank you.